Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Harshita Murthanti Kamath, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, and I'm the chair of the South Asia Seminar for this year. On behalf of Emory University's Michael C. Carlos Museum and the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies South Asia Seminar, I would like to welcome you to today's talk in conjunction with the Wondrous Worlds exhibition. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Carlos Museum and my colleagues at the Mesas Department for agreeing to sponsor this talk, and particularly to Elizabeth Horner for her help in organizing. Let me begin by introducing today's speaker, John Guy, who is the Florence and Herbert Irving Curator of the Arts of South and Southeast Asia at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He is also elected fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, London, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He formerly served as senior curator of South Asian art at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for 24 years. He has worked on a number of archaeological excavations, including maritime sites, and served as an advisor to UNESCO on historical sites in Southeast Asia. John has curated numerous international art exhibitions and published widely in both referee journals and collected volumes. He is the author of more than a dozen volumes, including, most recently, Lost Kingdoms, Hindu Buddhist Sculpture of Early Southeast Asia, published in 2014, and Art and Independence, Y.G. Srimati in the Indian Style, published in 2019. We are thrilled to have such an illustrious speaker with us at Emory. And if you want to learn more about his publications and a brief bio, there is a link to his bio into the chat. I will now turn it over to John Guy, whose talk is titled, quote, "The Early Indian Ocean Textile Trade to West Asia and its Indonesian Afterlife," end quote. Thank you very much, John, for coming to Emory virtually and being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marsh. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak in conjunction with this exhibition. My lecture today is, as introduced, exploring the historic Indian textile trade, really the first part of the second millennium, largely speaking, first half of the second millennium, as it existed from Western India principally to West Asia, primarily the Red Sea trade, and its extension, what I've called its afterlife in Indonesia, and the networking that tied this region, particularly the Arabian Sea, Western Indian Ocean, to the widest trading diaspora of its time globally. India has been the powerhouse of textile production throughout its history. Cotton textiles woven, painted, dyed with a variety of complex processes were to India what porcelain is to China, a commodity in which they excelled, securing market dominance, commanding global markets. India maintained a technological advantage with its mastery of dyeing processes that produced the finest and fastest colored cotton goods in the world. In this lecture, I want to explore India's historical trade in cotton goods, the Indian Ocean markets reaching from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia and beyond. This trading diaspora, served by the waters of the Indian Ocean, unites this vast region in the largest integrated trading system in the pre-modern world, allowing the circulation not only of commodities, people, ideas, religions, imagery, and art styles. The region where, looking at the subcontinental Indian map, three major production nodal centers for textiles. Firstly, upper left is centered around Gujarat, the cities of Cambay and its successor port city of Surat, Ahmedabad, Petapur, Patan. These are all major production centers involved in the textile production. Also Burhanpur on the Tapati River. Secondly, the Coromandel Coast, which stretches, of course, from southern Orissa all the way down to southern Coromandel Coast. And major centers for northern Coromandel, Masulipatam, and the southern coastal region, really starting with Pulicat, extending down to Nagapatnam. These were major production centers for painted cottons, particularly of exceptional quality. And the third center is really represented by the delta regions of the Ganges, Bengal, flows into the Bay of Bengal, the homeland for the finest muslins being produced in the subcontinent. The techniques combination of hand-drawn using the kalam, as you'll see lower left, rather equivalent to the device used for batik painting in the tulis in Indonesian batik. The production techniques were essentially village-based, really up until well into very modern times. The preparing of the cotton we see in a village photograph from the turn of the last century in Tamil Nadu. Pitloom weavers here in Kanchipuram, and the spinning of cloth and of thread, and the preparing of the cloth, locking it into place on the loom. The other technique, which is important, particularly for the earliest trade material, is the use of wooden blocks for transferring of mordants and resist dyes to the cotton fabric to imprint the patterns into the textiles before dyeing. And we see a block maker on the right here, and on the screen, three images which I think sum up much of what we'll talk about this afternoon. Lower left is a fragment of a Gujarati cotton, indigo blue, here with elephant and equestrian figure, excavated from Fostat in old Cairo, carbon dated to around the 10th century. To its right, this design with the rather charming little ducks, the Hamsa design of a type we see also from the Fostat remains, but this example is from Indonesia. And thirdly, on the upper screen, a pattern book from the beginnings of the 20th century, which just gives us a real sense of the continuity of this process, which we have from the 10th century radiocarbon dated piece below through to the 20th century production of block printed designs for the Thai or Siamese market, what were called in Gujarati Sudagiri textiles, a production and trade which continued really right up until disruption with the opening of the Second World War. All of this, of course, was driven by another agenda, and this was the global demand for spices. And as a key to so much of the history of the Indian Ocean, of course, a key to traditional trading systems, and a key to the motivation behind European interventions in the Indian Ocean trading world, and indeed in the Pacific as well. Cochin, one of the great centers, southwest coast of India, the Malabar Coast, historical home of black pepper and cinnamon coming from Sri Lanka, and nutmeg, cloves, mace, of course, coming further east from the Moluccas in eastern Indonesia. These are the key ingredients that drove an extraordinary story of trade and exchange over the next millennium. Now, we know that there was extensive and prolonged southern Indian trade with the Persian Gulf and Red Sea regions in antiquity. And we have small traces of this. I show you three examples of pottery, earthenware pottery, with Tamil, Southern Brahmi inscriptions on them. These were not trade items, these were most certainly utility wares to be used by itinerant merchants on the vessels they were traveling on, or in entrepot settlements where they were engaged in trade, but brought with them from southern India. The one on the upper left is from Qasr el-Qadim, the Red Sea port that was very important for the trade in the Roman period. The one on the right from Oman, and the lower one is actually from the Thai Peninsula, from Chompon province, and witnessing the extent of the Tamil diaspora in the region in the very beginnings of the first millennium. Trade, of course, with the Roman world, the wider diaspora extending from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia, is well documented archaeologically as well as textually. And we have the largest recorded findings of Roman coinage, base metal and precious metals have been outside Northern Europe have been recovered in southern India. A witness to the scale and intensity of the trading exchange that took place between particularly the west coast of India, but also there's evidence they operated on the east coast as well, to a lesser degree, engaged in textiles, the muslins of Bengal, much prized by the ladies of Rome. We know that spices were one of the prime items needed because it's a major preservative for foods as well as a flavoring element. And we know also that Indian ivory, we always think in terms of Roman ivory and Northern European ivory being sourced from sub-Saharan Africa, and that's, I'm sure, is broadly true. But recent research into Roman archives has indicated, has revealed even manifests from ships' loadings of Indian ivories being loaded on ships for the Roman market from the west coast of India. So again, we have this extensive network of trade that links the west coast of India, really from Gujarat, the Kondan coast around Mumbai, Maharashtra, down to the Malabar and indeed Sri Lanka, all in this intensive Western Indian Ocean trading system that fed through the Red Sea ports to Alexandria and then hence to the Mediterranean network. Looking east, the Bay of Bengal, of course, plays a key role in the trade of the subcontinent to Southeast Asia. Many of you will know that historically Southeast Asia is referred to in the earliest Indian sources, Pali and Sanskrit, and also in early Western geographers as the land of gold, Savana Bhumi, Savana Bipa. Sourcing alluvial gold seems to have been a major motivation in terms of Indian traders operating in Western Indonesia and peninsular Southeast Asia. Witness almost certainly as a Bengali merchant's seal, an impression of in clay on the upper screen, excavated in central Thailand. Date, 2nd, 3rd century, probably Common Era. And below, from the same time frame, but from South India, an item again excavated in the Thai Peninsula, which indicates from its Tamil Brahmi inscription as the property of the great goldsmith Perumal, so a tool used in the processing of gold and working of gold. And so it's very clear that those who came to source gold, which was principally alluvial gold from the coastal regions of island Southeast Asia, were also engaged in its processing. And secondary working was going on as well. This level of intensive engagement is borne witness in a number of different sources for the region. We also know of ingots of glass being traded west to east, and in fact glass working sites, glass processing sites again have been excavated in the first centuries of the first millennium in peninsular Thailand, and the glass almost certainly being sourced from the west. Shipwreck off the coast of Sri Lanka has revealed a large ingot of glass in association with first century Roman trade. So this could easily have been destined for one of these workshops in Southeast Asia where refined glass was not readily accessible and would then be processed into beads and other items which had local currency and value. The long reach of the Indian trader in the Indian Ocean is really quite remarkable. We've just spoken briefly of their activities in the Red Sea. If we move fast forward to the 9th century, we have the very famous column Copperplate Inscriptions from Kerala, dated 849, a contract of trade between a local ruler and then 3 co-signatories to that contract, one in Arabic, one in Middle Iranian, that's in Pahlavi script, and one Judeo-Christian in Hebrew script. So clearly this was a very cosmopolitan landscape across the Western Indian Ocean waters in which trade was being conducted. The other evidence is well known, and that is the Gennady Synagogue records from Old Cairo, from Fostat, Fatimid Cairo, spanning from the 10th to the 12th century. I show you a view of the Gennady, the storehouse building within the compound of the synagogue, in which a remarkable collection of documents. They were not archived in any sort of systematic sense. They were simply deposited as in posting a letter in a letterbox. These were documents which was deemed under Hebrew law should not be destroyed because they contain the written word, and therefore were preserved by simply putting them into this building where they accumulated. And when it was opened up in the beginning of the 20th century, you see a scholar from Cambridge on the right working on the material. So this is an extraordinary record of material, first worked on extensively by Gottheim, and provides, through the simple documents of contracts of sale, IOU documents, and so on, simple commercial contract material, which gives us a real insight into the trading nexus of the Red Sea world, centered at Cairo, and the range of participants, which range from Arab traders to Indian traders, of course, and Jewish traders, all working hand in hand. And some of the records that, when information that's emerged from these records is quite remarkable, including the reference to spices which were only sourced in Eastern Indonesia, cloves and mace and so on, being actively traded in Syria and Palestine. So, and documents recording the transactions surrounding those trading activities. So again, we have a very clear evidence of the depth of this network in the 10th, 11th century. Move to Southeast Asia in the same time frame. I show you this fragmentary inscription. It's a stele carved on 4 sides. It's a pillar inscription from Wondrous in West Sumatra, which was a great center for tree resins and other natural forest products and alluvial gold as well. And this is an inscription left by a Tamil merchant guild, dated to the 11th century epigraphically, and it speaks of merchants engaged in trade and being those who paid their subscription to the guild being permitted to sit on the spread cloth. In other words, to engage in commerce. And I show you a 17th century South Indian mural, which shows precisely that sort of activity, gem traders sitting on a little pavilion with a textile cushion, discussing the merits of particular gemstones and holding little money purses and gemstone purses as they do. The activity extension of the southern Deccani and southern Indian merchant guilds into Southeast Asia is quite remarkable. And see, we have a whole series of inscriptions from the late 1st millennium, which bear witness to this. The Ayavola Guild and a number of others. Southeast Asia itself was a very transient place. This is a view of Sambas in Borneo, but it could be a view of almost any coastal river estuary town in historic Southeast Asia up until the 20th century. This, what it reminds you of is how temporary and essentially mobile these centers were. If there was conflict, war, raiding, piracy, whatever, the inhabitants could pack and move to safety, to be so fortunate. And they had to preserve their wealth in things that were portable. And one of the key stores of value for these communities appears to have been cloth. So textiles were not only used for their utility, but also as a means of storing value. And this is, of course, something that's been very portable. Trading to these regions, we have references in Buddhist and Jain sources to trade with Southeast Asia. I show you an image of the Angara Buddha, protector of mariners, which you see here with the storm god Rahu lower right and distressed sailors lower left, pleading to the Buddha for savior. It's a classic image from 11th century Pala manuscript. And of course, the murals at Ajanta from the mid-5th century give us a little glimpse of this as well. This is the very famous mural from Cave 6, showing the scene from the Purna Avadana, the stories relating to the virtuous sandalwood trader Purna, who built palaces, shrines for the Buddha with the untold wealth that he made through sandalwood trading. He was a connoisseur of sandalwood and made a great fortune. He's shown at sea in a typical sailing vessel of the mid-5th century. You'll notice the storage jars stored on the stern of the vessel as well, and reminding us, of course, of the great trade in amphoras that occurred around the Indian Ocean, of which we have much archaeological evidence from Western India. 800 Central Java, Borobudur. This is, of course, the great famous image of the ocean sailing vessels without riggers operating in the Java Sea world, recorded on the Borobudur stupa complex, and of course an ancestor of the Indonesian prau, and an indication of the sophistication of long-distance trade at this time. We also, from these same temples, we have plenty of evidence, of course, of the depiction of textiles. Textiles that no longer survive, of course. Many were fragile and frail, diaphanous, fine muslins and delicately woven silks and brocades. Of course, none of that survived from 1,000 years ago. But we, of course, have the patterns, the memory of the patterns imprinted in the stone relief carvings of many of the great monuments of Central Java. This is Prambanan. You can look at Candisari, Pleosan, many others, in which we see these wonderful renderings of textile designs, some of which would appear to be Chinese-inspired, and other sources tell us that Chinese silks were traded to the region in the first millennium, and of course Indian designs. So the two great textile producing regions for silk and for cotton. But the story focuses now essentially on the role of the Arab-speaking traders and the role of the Arab dhow, of the key vessels. The Arab dhow is a remarkable piece of ship architecture, probably the greatest ship ever designed in many ways. Reputedly, it leaks like a sieve, but because of its stitched construction, it has the flexibility to survive in harsh waters and not break up. And this, of course, sets it apart from almost every other rigid constructed ship, which is riveted and bolted together and is therefore vulnerable to breaking in storms. And we have a number of these manuscript depictions of wrecks, and very recently, in the last less than decade, evidence of two shipwrecks in Southeast Asian waters, both of which display Arab ship architecture. Where they were made remains an open question, but they're large, heavy, timbered hulled vessels stitched together and corked, not with pins or dowels or nails. This is the recently discovered wreck from the Gulf of Thailand in the Delta area, directly south of Bangkok, the Phenom Syrian shipwreck, which is 20-something meters. The full length of the keel hasn't been fully determined. During its initial excavation, you see on the screen here, it was a vessel engaged in local regional trade. Whatever cargo it had obviously was either perishable or had already been sold. There was little material on board, but a small number of ceramics, some Chinese and some local Mon Khmer, Mon Thai, and most significantly for our discussion, some very distinctive types of torpedo jars, as you see here on the left. Not your typical West Asian Roman style, narrow tapering, but still the bulbous body, pointy bottom, standard iconography of a torpedo jar. And half a dozen of these were recovered, or fragments thereof. This is a fragment of the almost complete example. What was remarkable, that one of them had an inscription. And it was possible, I published this about 4 years ago, to identify the script as Pahlavi, so it's Middle Iranian script. Again, this must provide a clue to the merchants either funding the vessel or indeed engaged in the journey. And from the site to which this ship would have been trading, sites like Nakhon Pathom and Kubawa, these were major Mon urban centers, relatively close, linked by the river systems of the Thai, lower central Thailand. At those sites, we have stucco decorations of West Asian merchants. I'll show you one on the screen. So clearly we're building a picture here, which is becoming much clearer now than it was a decade ago, of the role of West Asian merchants, Arabic speakers, but also Pahlavi, Middle Iranian speakers as well. I want to now focus on 2 centers, and this map is lamentable because it doesn't show either. So if I use the pointer, one is Cambay, the historic port of Gujarat up in the northwest of India, if my pointer is visible, and its successor state of port of Surat. And the second, if we sail all the way around across to the Straits of Malacca to Malacca, which is where the pointer is now, more or less. These were 2 key port areas in the international trading system, which indeed extended from the Red Sea to eastern Indonesian Spice Islands. What I want to focus on now is the period from around 1500, 1510, and to a century later, to around 1600, 1620. And in that period, we see a quantum shift in the types of textiles, a diversification in the quality of cloths that were traded, and dramatic expansion in the design repertoire. Much of it is tailored to specific regional markets, to local taste. And this seems to be a new innovation, well, something which has pushed much more strongly than it had been in the past, when textiles were more generic. Key to this relationship is the 2 great entrepôts of this moment around 1500, Cambay in Gujarat, with its links to the Arabian Sea, and Malacca in tropical Southeast Asia. They served as the principal entrepôts for the gathering exchange of products along the international trade routes of Asia. A great variety of goods traveled these routes, but the premium items were spices, cloves and pepper, and the cotton cloth and dye stuffs employed in textile production. For the textile trade, Cambay was a crucial link in the chain of exchange, which stretched from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. A moment we have to acknowledge here is 1497, the arrival of Vasco da Gama in Calicut in southwest India, and the intervention, the intrusion of the Portuguese, followed by other European powers, of course, was highly disruptive to traditional Asian trading systems. The Portuguese, soon after they arrived, of course, were impressed and somewhat in awe of the scale of the Arab fleet of merchant ships that were assembled for the annual sailing across the Arabian Sea to Western India. This was the great Red Sea Yemeni trade to Gujarat, and it was an annual venture and of a scale that the Portuguese were somewhat humbled by. The Portuguese presence marked here by a 16th century terracotta tile from Bengal of a Katarak, the classic Portuguese warship that a familiar sight in the ports of India, Sri Lanka, and as far east as Japan, of course. In 1509, Alfonso Albuquerque was appointed the governor of all Portuguese possessions, and by 1511, he had seized Malacca in the Malay Straits, a strategic entrepot and a stepping stone in their quest to expand their interests as far as China itself. And in the ranks of the conquering Portuguese army was a pharmacist, Tomé Perez, and his account of his time in Malacca, 1512 to 1515, provides a unique window on the flourishing aiding trading system that the Portuguese conquered and attempted to control. In his Summa Oriental, published in 1515, he wrote, "Cambe stretches out her arms. With her right arm she reaches towards Aden, and with the other towards Malacca. Malacca cannot live without Cambe, nor Cambe without Malacca. They are to be very rich and very prosperous. The trade of Cambe is extensive and comprises cloths of many kinds and of fair, which is good, high quality." Most of the ships that were coming were Arab dhows of this type. And this interdependence that Tomé refers to, that Cambe was dependent for its prosperity on the forest and spice trade channeled through Malacca, was echoing a pattern we'd seen centuries earlier when Gujarati traders operated out of Cambe to serve the Red Sea trade. So we're seeing the same pattern being repeated at the other side, opposite side of the Indian Ocean, some centuries later. The discovery of Indian trade textiles in the Red Sea is a reminder then that the arrival of Islam in India was inextricably linked with the commerce and role of the Arab merchant, just as it was several centuries later in Southeast Asia. It would not be surprising that many of the trade cloths discovered in Southeast Asia are analogous to those found in the Middle East. The wealth that was involved in much of this merchant activity is staggering. Barbosa, writing a short time after Perez, comments, "A certain merchant," referring to one of the West Asian merchants coming to Malacca, would alone discharge 3 or 4 ships laden with every kind of valuable good and reladen them once there from his own stock. There's clearly enormous wealth involved in all of this. We have another window on the presence of the Arab diaspora in the Indian Ocean world, and that is the distribution of tombstones. And those who could afford it, you wanted a high-end tombstone, then you made arrangements. You probably carried it as ballast in your ship to commission or buy off the shelf a Cambe marble tombstone with a small blank area left where the names of the deceased could be added later. The rest was fully decorated. I show you a complete cenotaph with tomb headstone on the right, is still in Cambe, and the textile patterns get repeated. Here is an almost identical one, but this example is preserved in the north coast of Java in the city of Gresik. And Gresik was a key trading city, and the tombstone tells us that it's the tomb of Malik Ibrahim, who died in 1419 in North Coast Java, Indonesia. And almost certainly, although it doesn't specify, a member of the merchant community. And we do know that the leading members of the merchant communities throughout Southeast Asia, even including in the ports of South China, the most senior post, which is that of the Shah Bandar, the controller of maritime trade, was held by Arabic or Persian-speaking merchant. And of course, Shah Bandar is a Persian word, which then absorbed into Malay and becomes the standard term for harbor master, controller of trade at a particular port. Perez tells us up to 30 varieties of cloth from Gujarat, adding that all were traded, all the cloths and things from Gujarat have trading value in Malacca and in the kingdoms which trade with Malacca. A very important last point in trade with Malacca, because Malacca was located on a rather impoverished hinterland. They didn't grow their own rice. They weren't self-sufficient. They were really just a trading center, rather like, dare I say it, like Singapore today, but with no hinterland, no natural resources to sustain them, just as Singapore today draws its water from Malaysia, piped into the city. It's the lifeblood of Singapore. Malacca had to buy its rice from Java principally and other places. But what they were trading and where the great wealth and profits lay were, of course, in controlling the Eastern Indonesian spice trade. So our picture begins to build. We have additional sources and an unexpected one in the 13th century. In the first quarter, we have a Chinese account from the Shah Bandar, the harbor master of Chonjo in Fujian, Zhou Ruhua, who tells us that yes, very good. He didn't travel. We know a little about his life, but he clearly gathered his intelligence from sailors and ship's captains who frequented his port, and he clearly interrogated them closely and wrote his detailed account of international trade, which was published in 1225. He tells us of Gujarat, which he calls one of the western country of India. India was understood by the Chinese as really 4 countries, north, south, east, and west, roughly speaking. So Gujarat, he says, the western country. From Melwar, the interior of Maharashtra, every year 2,000 oxen or more laden with cotton stuff, goods, cloth, was sent over the roads to Bharata. We're going to Cambay, of course, but for international trade. Yeah, he also says, continuing, the inhabitants of Gujarat wear close-fitting clothes with a cotton sarong wrapped around. The native products comprise great quantities of indigo, red dye stuffs, black dye stuffs, foreign cotton goods of every color. Every year, these goods are transported to the Arab countries for sale. So again, knowledge of this interaction was widely shared across the Indian Ocean world. Let me turn now to some of the cloths themselves. It's apparent from these sources, Gujarat, though it's a premier port of Cambay and it's supported by its hinterland states, was a major source of cotton and dye stuffs. Yet great as this commerce was, there's evidence, largely numismatic, that suggests India experienced a deficit with its Western Indian Ocean markets, caused largely by the appetite in the subcontinent, the demand for war machines, for war horses particularly, and other military equipment. It's interesting that some of the earliest textiles we have show war campaign. Here we see a ruler on an elephant with equestrian soldiers accompanying him on a large display cloth. I'll come to in a moment. And a detail here, the combat and hunting scenes represented in this textile combination, the typical 2-way color scheme of this reddish, now faded, mordant dyeing, and the indigo resist, giving the blues, the principle, the red, madder red, and the indigo blue. Equestrian combat scenes, battle scenes being shown, and so on. Now, Malacca was able to consolidate its control of the spice and textiles trade in the course of the 15th century, working in concert with Arab and other Asian traders upon whom they depended for their prosperity. The commercial and religious alliances formed facilitated not only dynamic trade in textiles, but a new awareness of Southeast Asia, awareness in Southeast Asia of Arabic and Western Indian Muslim culture, which had a significant impact on the region, which has not really been, to this day, fully evaluated. but we get a glimpse of this in the range of textiles that were circulating. So I show on the screen fragments excavated in Fostart with designs that we recognize also in Indonesia from this early period, depicted in sculptural and temple decoration. Again, Fostart textiles with this stepped square. Often when you see this in paintings or more pictorial designs, these represent wells or step wells. Which brings us, of course, to the most famous stepwell of all, Queen Rani Kevak's stepwell, 11th century stepwell in Gujarat, northern Gujarat, towards Patan, which has this extraordinary architectural feat. It has these wonderful carved blind windows with various designs, which are really a veritable catalogue of textile designs. We can do a pick and match exercise looking at so many of these designs and analogous translation into textiles. Two-way street, and who knows which came first. We also know that the Arab trade from the Arabian Peninsula, Red Sea world to India had a very important commodity, which was related to military activity, and that was cavalry. Horses being traded, particularly, we have good documentation this from the Portuguese sources for the trade to Vijayanagar, for example, from the Deccan. And then here is a slightly later, I think from the very close of the Vijayanagar period, mural painting in Tamil Nadu, down towards Nagapattinam, in which we see Arab horse traders in a dhow. There's a large mural painting in the vestibule of a Hindu temple. So a clear indication of the important role of foreign merchants trading in the region, and the acknowledgement of their role by local rulers who were having to engage and give permits and so on for this trade to be conducted. So these are the type of textiles that we're seeing circulating by this time, the Hamsa designs from Fostart and their direct parallels later in time, nonetheless representing a continuum from the early period. So this example from Fostart from probably around the 11th, 12th century, and the example on the screen from Indonesia from around the 16th century, all produced in Gujarat, all block printed. And in this particular instance, we have not only a maker's drop ink stamp on one of the borders, but there's also a second stamp which has been added at Surat, the 17th century, merchant's stamp in Arabic script. The Hamsa design continues on, and we see it here in a relatively late manifestation, 18th century example, telling us the extent to which these designs continued on and had an afterlife in Indonesia. Perez, returning to Tommy Perez, he says that the Gujarats have factories or go-downs, warehouses, where everywhere, who live and set up business in places like Bengal, Pegu, and Lower Burma, Siam, Padir, Kadar, and Malaysia. There is no place where you do not see Gujarati merchants. Gujarati ships come to these kingdoms every year, one ship straight to each place. So again, you can see the seminal role of the monsoon trading system and these highly profitable journeys that were made, and highly profitable, but also high risk. Many ships were lost at sea through natural calamity, cargoes lost, perished, go-downs often built of brick with a thatch roof, dangers of fire, and so on. So not without its risks, of course. I show you a view of Malacca, not from Perez's time, but a century later. It's a Dutch engraving in 1724, a century or more after Perez's time. but it shows precisely what Perez had described. He talks about the Malacca, the Sultan of Malacca, who converted to Islam in the 14th century, no doubt a very wise move for business. We see here this footbridge across the river, which still exists, variations of this today, which was known to house trading stalls for vendors to sell their wares, and then go-downs lined along the foreshore of the river system seen here. And of course, lots of other buildings added by the Portuguese and the Dutch later. So at the beginning of the 16th century, the city-state of Malacca had enjoyed its status as a commercial hub of Southeast Asian exchange for over a century, making it a necessary conquest for the Portuguese as they built their commercial chain that linked Lisbon via Goa to Macau and Nagasaki. And Malacca was the key prize in that chain. Well, integrating this is evidence of datable textiles allows for a more holistic understanding of the circulation of commodities in the Indian Ocean in this early modern period. We have radiocarbon dates from a whole range of textiles now, which span from the 10th century through the 16th and even 17th centuries. The technique is less reliable as we move closer in time. Let me take you through some of the samples. So here is a fragment from Fostart of this forested landscape design, which we have handkerchief-sized fragments surviving, but from Indonesia we have sarong length entire cloths intact from a later period. So here is a detail of Indonesian sourced forested landscape, little pearl borders defining the perimeters of each tree variety, very clearly distinguished. You see here the same treatment appearing in painted painted textiles. Jain Yantra dated 1447 on the upper screen, on the lower painted scroll celebrating spring, the Vasanta Valasa, joy of spring, 15th century Gujarati poem about the coming of spring, with these conventions clearly crossed between the painted world and the textile world very comfortably. These cloths were big and they were robust. This is what a complete cloth would look like. Two full-length pieces then joined longitudinally in the middle. These are not matching, but you get the sense of it. So the complete cloth is going to be nearly 2 meters wide and 3 to 4, sometimes even 5 meters in length. Spectacular. Too large, of course, to be comfortable items of dress, and often too heavy. These were display items. They became items for use in ritual rites of passage and so on in Southeast Asia, and appear to be made for that market, for that purpose. These knot cloths would have any immediate or obvious application in India itself. You couldn't wear these cloths, many of them. Here's one of the finest examples of fragment of this type of textile from Indonesia that's come down to us. Another category of the landscape cloths are those with figurative designs. These beautiful landscape cloths, again, not a cloth you could wear, which we see these Gujarati ladies and celestial entertainers, whatever they might be intended to represent. We know that when Jain images of Tatankaras are installed, that female celebrants do stick dances and so on in honoring the installation of Mahavira or whichever Jinna it is. This could be related to that as well. Here we have another example on the right, a figure, and she's holding a parrot, rather not so difficult to, rather poor registration of color, so it's hard to read, but that's the form of the parrot resting on her raised hand. And of course, the parrot in association with a woman or indeed a man is traditionally has amorous associations. And on the left, a fragment from Fostart, in which we see a life-size depiction of a human figure. The pointed nose, the projecting eye, and so on, the distended earlobe with jewelry ornaments. So clearly there were figurative cloths also going to the Red Sea trade. Detail of the Vasampa Spring Festival painting, you get a sense of these figures with their pointy noses and projecting eyes. It's a very distinctive convention. You see variations of it here, the use of the wearing of the shawl and so on. You can see how this became very comfortably adapted and acculturated in Southeast Asia. There's in the island of Florence, in which Indian silk patola are being worn as shawls by these young women performing this ceremonial dance, and clearly growing out of this tradition of prized objects, which are heirloom objects, communally owned for the most part. The variations in the treatment of the women figures, you see that as we're moving through in time here, probably from the beginning of the 16th to the 18th centuries, the eye convention has become exaggerated and distorted, almost a parody of itself by the 18th century. Figures holding instruments. She's got a veena here, for example. The ear ornament has the Hamsa design. You recognize all the familiar motifs. These had an impact of the convention for the silhouetted eye, the projecting nose, and so on. This, I would suggest, finds an afterlife in Japanese culture and is associated with refinement. The pointy nose, slender-eyed figures are the halus, refined nobility, as opposed to those with bumpy noses and wide eyes, perhaps protruding teeth, who were regarded as coarse and vulgar. So these two categories are represented in, particularly in, you see it in what's almost now a lost art, which is the painted hand-scrolled tradition of Wayang Beber, a court entertainment in Central Java, of which we have a very few surviving examples. The story continues, Fostad left, Indonesia, right, and this continuation of in which these designs are repeated and take on new manifestations. Dancing figures. We've often heard the term long cloth, and we saw those warp threads being drawn down the Tamil village street on a frame being prepared for weaving. These cloths can be of almost unlimited length and are made with repeat designs, which were then cut to demand at the point of sale. We know this because the Dutch guilty many of these cloths, and many of them have a Dutch VOC chop mark at the point at which the cut occurs. So they would have been shipped to Batavia as roll bolts of cloth of very substantial length, which were then cut to order, just as you would buy cloth from a milliner today. And some were cut and some were not. And here, they often found a life in Sulawesi and other Eastern Indonesian islands, where they were not for wearing, but for ceremonial display, and were associated with local mythology, were absorbed into local belief systems, and were assigned pushtaka, heirloom value, because of their exotic nature, because they're coming from another place. Ramayana stories also found their way to Indonesia on textiles. You can relate this obviously to South Indian temple cloth painting, but there's nothing quite like it in South India, although it clearly draws on the skills of those artists. Here we see two sections, Rama and Ravana, in their deadly combat. And of course, the very grand cloths used by the VOC, they try to control the use of these high-end patola from Gujarat, the doubly cut cloths gifted specifically to local rulers to buy favor for trading concessions. One of the great examples. And the status of these cloths continues into the modern day. Early 20th century photograph from the Sultan's court of Solo, the crown prince, with his family, is a photo from the 1920s. And what do they choose to display as the backdrop? Not a batik, but a imported Gujarati silk patola with elephant and tiger design. So clearly these cloths retained their status in court circles up until modern times. Also patchwork designs, which really is a repertoire of all the textile types you've been looking at this afternoon, going right back to Fostad. But why in a patchwork? Well, there's a very specific reason why the Javanese valued patchwork designs, and that comes out of the Islamic tradition of tailoring talismanic jackets in patchwork, which were served as, had a protective role to play, would protect the wearer against danger or disease. And these were worn in combat. And also here we see the Sultan Mengkubuwana of Jakarta around 1900 wearing one of these jackets, the golden ear ornaments, and note the trousers, which are in the patola design, tailored from patola. And patola itself, widely used in Indonesia up until the 20th century, and let's say the first half of the 20th century, but also copied in Indian painted cotton. So you get low-end versions of these in painted cotton, replicating the patola repertoire. I show you the Dutch encampment at Bantan in West Java, which immediately preceded Batavia, in which we see, I pulled a detail for you here below a screen. These figures are generally identified as holding rolls of cloth, and they're identified by a little key as the cloth traders. You'll notice the palisade enclosure for the Bantan, and beyond that, what looks like a little Dutch country church, except it has a crescent moon at the top, so we know it's a mosque. The mosque at Bantan, which still survives today, looked nothing like that. Gem traders, here there's a classic image of the key players in traditional Asian trade, the Arab merchant, the Javanese merchant, and the Chinese. This sums up much of what Southeast Asian trade was about. And clearly the Javanese is in the process of selling a golden ring to the Arab trader. This interplay of painted cottons and patola repeats itself again and again. And I just want to conclude with cloth. The role of cloth really is currency. I show you the portrait of the King of Tidor. This is one of the islands of the Moluccas, Saifuddin, from the late 17th century. Obviously a Dutch painting. He's shown dressed in a jacket tailored from rich European fabric, almost certainly provided by the Dutch, combined with locally woven headband and waist sash, and wears a Dutch gold chain of office. And we know that Saifuddin paid his retainers in an annual supply of Indian cloth secured from the Dutch in exchange for granting the VOC a monopoly on his island's riches, which were the cloves, the nutmeg, and the mace. These textiles that bring alive the historical sources in a way that only real artifacts can do. The visual evidence of their shared design, vocabulary, their physical characteristics of fiber and weave type demonstrate that Gujarati dyed cotton textile trade was an Indian Ocean phenomenon spanning the entire length of that region. It was a shared commercial enterprise which carried within it a cultural component, which arguably outlived the economic and had a more profound impact on the region. This legacy persists in Southeast Asia, embedded both in the local textile design traditions and in cultural attitudes to cloth. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John, for this amazing set of materials. Oh, yes, I know that. Thank you so much for this amazing set of materials, and thanks to you all in the audience. Just as a reminder, if you can please put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can answer them. We have a whole list of questions, so thank you all for putting your questions into the chat. From an anonymous attendee who thanks you for your images, asks, what do you think is the purpose of illustrating walls or pillars with textile designs? Is it for aesthetic reasons, or is it a reflection of a history that is sort of documenting for historical purposes? Or do you think it has a different purpose?
I didn't quite catch the very beginning of that. To do with the use of color, did you say?
And what is the purpose of illustrating these walls and pillars with textile designs?
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I think as we see in 9th century Java, for example, and elsewhere, I think in temple architecture, the temple is an abode of the god, so it's the adornment should be made as rich and palatial and otherworldly as possible. And certainly we know that real textiles were extensively used in temple decor. And even today, if you're performing a puja, it's often you'll have a textile canopy suspended directly above the location of where that puja takes place, or a textile canopy held at four corners over the main murti, or the image that's under worship. So textiles play a very central role in defining a sacred space. I think what we're seeing in the 9th century reliefs from Java that I showed is an attempt to record the memory of these rich and lavish textiles, on which no doubt vast sums of money were spent procuring them, and transient. They would only last a few generations in a tropical climate before they disintegrated. But adding great richness to those temples, so a way of perpetuating the memory of that in the reliefs. In many cases, we don't have firm evidence for this. Many of those carved surfaces would have been stucco rendered and then painted, so they would have actually had the appearance of the original textile.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Faye Popper, who's asking about the interaction across the Royal Siamese Court and Indian Textiles, and also the Burmese Court. So she asked, did the Burmese Court order from Gujarati Textiles? And what was the interactions also across the Royal Siamese Court and Gujarati Textiles?
Okay. We have a lot of evidence for the Siamese court, particularly in the 17th century under the reign of Prana Rai in particular, who sent ambassadors to Louis XIV's court at Versailles, well documented. We know that the Siamese court maintained very active control through the Ministry of Finance. They had a two-part ministry. One was for Eastern trade, i.e. China, and one was for Western trade, i.e. India world. And the India world trade actively sent ships from Tenasserim and these Andaman seaports to the Coromandel coast. So they were primarily trading with the Coromandel, not with Gujarat directly. Gujarati textiles, certainly. I mean, Perez says, the Gujaratis were everywhere. I mean, you couldn't escape them. So yes, of course, they were there. We know they were at Ayutthaya along with all the others, and at various sites in the Thai Peninsula as well. So, but the evidence we have for Siam is particularly from the 17th century, when we get a whole flurry of both Persian and French accounts of trade at Ayutthaya under Prana Rai and the late 17th century. And so that is well documented. And textiles play a very important part of court protocol. Textiles were commissioned to design, Siamese placed, and then given to as indicators of rank to nobility and to foreigners as diplomatic gifts. So cloth played a very key role in all of that.
So we have a question also related to, two more questions related to textiles. The first being, was there any Buddhist-related motifs in textile patterns and designs?
Any Buddhist design related?
Yes, Buddhist motifs.
Okay. That's a slightly slippery slope. Many designs which we say, oh yes, that's Buddhist, which is true, but it's also Jain. It also fits into a wider Brahmanical world. Much of the design repertoire of early India is shared. almost all of it, in fact, across sectarian lines. So it's part of a wider cultural expression, and very little of it, I'd say, is specifically Buddhist. The evidence we have for Buddhist participation, I mean, we must remember that the Buddhists were a spent force in India by the beginning of the 13th century. I mean, they'd had it in India. They had an afterlife elsewhere, but in India they were really done. Their time was over. So Jains continued, of course, as a major trading community, but were content largely to trade in other people's things. Although, of course, the Patola production of northern Gujarat was a very important part of this trade, Jain well, they're not involved in the production, but Jain merchants were almost certainly involved in the marketing and distribution of many of these cloths through Cambay and Surat.
I think that's a good point to bring across the shared sets of designs across these traditions. Anvesha Das, who's a graduate student at Emory, asks, do we see any changes in the designs on the textiles or any particular kinds of textiles being demanded based on where they were being exported to?
On where they were going, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I didn't really have time to go into that. It's another whole subject in a sense. But yes, that's a very good question, because particularly from the end of the 16th century into and certainly the 17th century and later, increasing market orientation, specialization is taking place. And of course, we're well documented from the 17th century onwards, from the Dutch East India Company and the English company as well. And you routinely read about these complaints that we attempted to market a particular design in a certain place, and it had three bands on the border and not two, and was rejected. They were very specific about what they want. The Japanese were notorious for being fickle and changing every season, wanting something new. And of course, the whole turnaround of commissioning something in India, cash advance to the weavers and dyers, come back 6 months later and collect the goods, fit into the monsoon pattern, get the goods up to Japan. You're looking at it, it's not exactly a very quick process. In the meantime, the Japanese decided that's gone out of fashion. So, and this is talked about quite explicitly in records, in trading company records. So they were stuck with goods they couldn't market because taste had changed or whatever.
So related to that, actually, Scott Kugel asked a question about the torpedo jars, saying, were they used to transport, what kinds of commodities were they being used to transport? And also, why did these jars have tapered bottoms? He says that they seem inconvenient in their shape, but there must be some sort of special purpose for having it designed that way.
Okay, so torpedo jars are a curious phenomenon in a way, because they exist in the ancient world. Of course, we think of them almost as Mediterranean, which is where they began, of course. Then they had this afterlife. So the jar I showed you from the Thai shipwreck, almost certainly made in the Persian Gulf. And they're high-fired earthenware and typically lined with bitumen. So this, of course, makes them waterproof, impervious, and could be used for transporting oil. We know that in earlier times, there are records of wine being transported in amphora, of course, is one of the traditional uses of amphora. But these large, open, rather more, the proportions have changed over time, obviously. This is quite a wide neck, about 70 centimeters, and a bulbous body, and of course the pointed bottom. My understanding is that design, of course, is most comfortably if you're trying to maximize capacity storing into the interior of the hull of a ship, which has tapering curved profile. And so you'll do best by stacking an amphora shape rather than square bottomed or whatever, which would waste space. I think this is the origin of the amphora. And of course, large quantities have been found all down the west coast of India, clusters of them in monasteries in Sri Lanka from the first millennium. There's significant presence, but this is a new type we've not seen before that's coming from the Gulf of Thailand. And the fact that it's got a Pahlavi script inscription on it points to Iranian merchants. Pahlavi, of course, is a Sasanian language, Middle Iranian, Pahlavi is Iranian script, Sasanian script, which has an afterlife beyond the Sasanian period, used by merchants, particularly from Southeast Iran. I mean, this is the origins of the Parsis in Bombay and so on. I mean, these are Zoroastrian communities for the most part.
Wonderful. It's fascinating to think about the design being shaped by how they were being carried in the hull of the ship. So Mary Davis asks, why was patchwork design viewed as protective?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question, but it's the role of talismanic jackets in the Islamic world is well studied, there are other analogies one can draw. I'm not sure if they're relevant. The Buddha made his robes from discarded scraps recovered from other deceased people. So the Buddha is often represented with a patchwork robe, not a plain robe. And that's an indication of, because of the importance of detachment, that you could wear soiled cloth from a corpse, stitched together in a patchwork of whatever you could recover. And this was enough to be worn by the Buddha because you were not concerned with material things. So there is that tradition in the Buddhist world, but to my understanding, it's not specifically talismanic. That is a specifically Islamic tradition, and I'm not Islamicist. I'm not equipped to really go into that. I'm sorry.
Thank you. So we have some more questions about textiles. Smita Parikh asks, what is the difference between the textiles that were exported from Bengal to Europe and other parts around 1800 and those from Gujarat?
Okay, well, it's largely a question of technique. The Gujaratis are principally producing hand-painted and especially block-printed, mordanted and resist dyed. That's the madder reds and the indigo blues. The Coromandel, almost exclusively kalamkari, the same technique. And Bengal, a range of textiles, including brocades, and of course these superfine muslins, the so-called Dhaka muslin, which is highly regarded. So there's a whole range. They all had their markets, and found their niche markets in Europe and elsewhere, and indeed in the clipper trade from Boston in the later periods and so on. Represent another aspect of this when there was American participation in this trade as well.
And Nargis Virani, who is a colleague also in MESAS in my department, asks, are there narratives that record conversion motives? If yes, is there a predominant reason recorded for conversion? I'm assuming this means religious conversion.
The very beginning of that question again about conversion.
Are there any narratives that record conversion?
Okay, well, I wouldn't say there are narratives, but I mean, the coming of the expansion of the Gujarati trade in Southeast Asia impacted first in Aceh in North Sumatra, and then the north coast of Java, the Pasisir region of north coast Java. These were the trade and the general conversion to Islam is fairly well documented. We see the rise of Islam from this time. The conversion of the Sultan of Malacca a century earlier was a sort of waving the flag, and you have these two strong traditions happening in the Indonesian islands, particularly Western Indonesia, One is the very substantial Chinese migration on the back of the Ming voyages. And the second is the, when we say Gujarati traders, we're principally talking, as best we can tell, Gujarati Muslim traders. And almost certainly forming consortium with other Muslim traders who may not even be Gujarati themselves, probably joining forces with Red Sea traders and other complex mercantile arrangements. So, and yes, and then there was, there are two mosques in Java which are regarded as the homeland of Islam in Indonesia. One is in Demak, bang in the middle of the north coast, and the other is Bantan, which was a great trading entrepot the Dutch took over and booted out the British and so on. So these were the major centers for the spreading of Islam. And we know that with the collapse of the Majapahit kingdom in East Java, for example, that appears to have been largely driven by North Coast commercial interests. And much of that had a strong Islamic presence. I showed you the tombstone of Malik Ibrahim from the mid-15th century, Gujarati tombstone, substantial, cenotaph, installed where he died in Java, in Gresik, nearby Demak. So this is a very tightly knit network, and yes, the conversion went hand in hand with the commerce.
And as a follow-up question, Nargis asks if there was any interest or any evidence of religious conversion on textiles.
Ooh. Well, two points to make. One is that many of the textiles from Fostat and the Red Sea sites are pre-Islamic. So there's another chapter. Then the later period materials, such as we see from the Yemen and elsewhere, often do have Islamic elements in their designs. Things for which we could find parallels in other medium of Islamic art. And that's true of Indonesia as well. So some of the designs do have an Islamic element, and I would suggest that goes back to the earlier question about tailoring to particular market tastes and preferences. It's not necessarily evangelizing, it's simply what do those people like in those towns on Aceh or Bantan or something. So give them a mix of these designs and see if they like it. I mean, this is marketing. I think that's the extent of it. By the 19th century, we are seeing there was a big revival in batik, in traditional Indonesian resist textiles in the 19th century, which we think may be linked to a shortage of supply of Indian cloth. And so it became a stimulus to local production. And embedded in that is a whole subgroup of textiles which have Quranic verses painted in resist dye. So you get this genre of Islamic batik, both sarong for waistcloth, head cloths, shoulder shawls. With Islamic calligraphy as part of has become a decorative element.
Wonderful. I think that answers that question from Nargis. I will conclude by asking one final question for myself and my own research interests. I was really struck by the 9th century copperplate inscription from Kerala that you had earlier on in the talk. And I was wondering if you have other examples of copperplate inscriptions that you found in your materials and what they were used for.
What they refer to, you mean?
Yes, what they refer to.
Yeah. Well, the column, when copperplate inscriptions become a major phenomenon in India, in the sort of post-Gupta world, you start out inscribing your temples, your door jambs, and your plinths of monuments, and then, but that's usually religious dedications. But for secular documents, particularly land titles, copperplate becomes very, very important. And we see there's a whole body of chola material, for example, the column copperplates from Kerala are a pretty much unique case, best to my knowledge, in that they carry four languages: the host, who's the local ruler, and then the three foreign merchant communities, each of whom repeat the oath, signing in their own languages, so that is a very special and unique document, and one which kind of opens up a whole vista of Indian Ocean connectivity in a way that's really quite extraordinary from the mid-9th century.
Wonderful. Well, the reason I was asking is I'm working with a poet whose poetry is actually inscribed on copper plates in the Vijayanagara period. And so it's it's an unusual case to see copper plates being used in that way. I know that they're used commonly for land grants, and oftentimes inscriptions will, especially in the Vijayanagara period, will be in multiple languages. But I was curious to see the copper plates show up here. Well, I know that we are over the time that we allotted for questions. There are so many wonderful questions, and I know several of you have asked multiple questions, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to everyone's, but if you would like, you can reach out to John Guy through the website link is present in the chat, and I might ask Elizabeth to actually put that in again. But thank you very much for coming and speaking to us at Emory and sharing your enormous sense of breadth of scholarship in this area. And we look forward to actually being able to physically come to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the near future when things are safe to travel. So thank you all as well in the audience for attending today's talk. And please look on our Carlos Museum website for the many, many speakers and discussions that will be coming up in the coming months in related to the Wondrous Worlds exhibition. Thank you again, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you.